A warm welcome to those tuning in to our discussion on the topic of who owns peer reviews. I'm Elizabeth Moylan. In my day job, I'm Senior Editor within Biomed Central's Research Integrity Group, and I'm also a volunteer for COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. I'm joined by Pete Binfield, publisher and co-founder jointly with Jason Hoyt of the open access journal PeerJ, with considerable experience in the world of academic publishing, including developing the mega journal PLOS ONE. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Pleased to be here.
This week we're celebrating Peer Review Week 2016, and the theme this year is recognition for peer review. And I think it's fair to say that until recent times, people haven't really talked much about giving credit or recognition to reviewers for undertaking peer review. I think peer reviewers simply engaged in the activity or not as part of the normal process of being in research. So, Pete, you kindly took part in the panel debate at the recent COPE North American seminar where we discussed some issues around who owns peer reviews. But can I first ask you, have you got any insights into why we're moving into the direction of giving recognition for peer review?
You know, this is potentially just a broader trend in academia, but I think that academics are being expected to be measured and reported back on about more and more of what they do in their academic world. So I think there's more checking up on people, there's more research evaluation exercises and so on. And obviously peer review is one of those elements of being an academic that has previously gone somewhat uncredited, unnoticed. It happens privately, in a confidential forum, and it's almost been just expected to be part of the job of being an academic. So I think people are now starting to want to be credited for doing their peer reviews, and we've certainly seen the rise of a few organizations that are facilitating that. Places where people can either openly critique and peer review or openly credit their prior peer reviews. So I think it's part of a broader trend.
Yes, I would agree with you, and I think the thing that has also perhaps facilitated that recognition is the rise in open peer review. I think that's played a part, and by open peer review we mean, of course, that authors get to know who the reviewers are, and if the manuscript is published, then that report also accompanies publication. And I think that has also coincided with the need for recognition and perhaps indeed facilitated that. So I wonder if you can share some more thoughts with us on what you're hearing from researchers on the topic, Pete.
For example, from reviewers, I've heard that the head of a lab, for example, emailed me and said, well, 3 of my lab mates have peer-reviewed this paper jointly. Can we all get credit for having done these peer reviews? Because as a lab, we're attempting to track all of our peer review activity. And that was interesting because traditionally, we've at least only credited the single peer reviewer for the peer review. But this was a joint peer review, and so how could they get joint credit for that? Another snippet of data from our experience is our open optional peer review of the ability of authors to make their peer reviews public on the published paper. And when we set that up, when we launched PeerJ, myself and Jason thought that perhaps the uptake of this wouldn't be so high. We made it optional, and it was almost an experiment to see how many people took it up. But right now, just over 80% of authors are choosing to make their peer review history fully public. So again, that's an encouraging the high percentage, I think, of people that actually want this process to be open and want to demonstrate to the world, the peer review process they went through, their rebuttals, how they evolved their publication, basically.
That is astonishingly high, actually. That's higher than I would have imagined. Of course, even though the peer review process is open, it's still confidential until, the process is complete. And I certainly, wearing my author hats, have been in situations where I've received some open peer review reports, and for whatever reason, the manuscript's not published or accepted for publication, and I want to take those reports and go to the next journal, but am I free to do that? I think this comes down to what we'd like to see now, perhaps wearing our publisher's hat in what we can and cannot share. Have you got any thoughts on that?
In my mind, the ideal process is that everything is fully open, that it's just openly known whether or not a paper was peer-reviewed and what the review reports were, and future journals can make decisions based on that if the first journal were to reject it. But it's a tough one, definitely, and in my mind, there's sort of two specific cases where it sort of really comes to the fore. When a paper has been reviewed and rejected simply because it's not, a good fit for the journal, or the impact isn't high enough, for example. So the paper is acceptable and would be acceptable at another journal, but has been rejected by the first journal. It feels to me like the reviews should be quickly reused at the second journal and an acceptance decision made based on that input. That seems reasonable and fair and doesn't waste anybody's time in re-reviewing an article. There's a second place where I think the rubber really hits the road when an article is reviewed and found to be unpublishable. It's fatally flawed in some way. The reviews have identified errors. In that situation, what often happens, unfortunately, is authors simply turn around and take the same paper and submit it to another journal and keep doing so until they're lucky enough to find reviewers that don't notice those flaws. And I think that's a critical moment in the peer review process. If as a reviewer or as a journal a paper is flawed, is it ethical to allow that paper to be continue to be submitted elsewhere until it's accepted without forewarning the community, forewarning the future journal that you found some errors and those should be addressed or at least rebutted in some way. I think that's a real interesting use case of the concept of open peer review, I guess.
I think that's absolutely right and fascinating, and I think there are parallels there with clinical papers where trials are registered beforehand and everybody can see openly what you intended to do, and maybe there are parallels there in the biology world that we could follow.
When I was doing my research for the COPE seminar that we participated in, I found a couple of interesting blogs that actually address this kind of issue. There were some interesting quotes in the comments from some quite progressive members of the academic community, I guess. These are people who are cognizant and sensitive, I think, to the issues at play, but also well aware that that there's an ethical responsibility here. If you've identified flaws, should this paper enter the literature, and then if it does, where is the redress? In the past it would have been a letter to the editor of the journal, which is clearly not a good model in the internet era.
It's certainly challenging and difficult, and I think in those cases it's still good to flag to the editor so that the editor can hopefully take forward and resolve the issue. Well, thank you very much, Pete. I think you've admirably covered the topic and provided some food for thought there, and I would hope that and encourage that sets the scene for what we wanted to provoke with the COPE discussion document, and I would encourage people to read it and comment and add their feedback. Thanks very much.
And thanks to COPE for bringing this discussion to the fore. It's an important one.